Good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome back to the Enterprise AI Show. I'm your host, Brian Gracely. And today we are going to, a little bit early for the end of the month, but we're going to dive into AI News of the Month with Brandon Whichard. We're going to dive into some trends. We get a little bit philosophical on kind of where enterprise AI is specifically. So we spend a lot less time on some of the announcements. They are in the show notes. You can take a look, click on them. Lots and lots of announcements this month. But we really kind of dive into sort of where we think enterprise AI is, both from the good and the bad and the unknown. So spend a lot of time on that this month, digging into the news of the month and, a few other odds and ends things like, the Pope weighed in on AI. So that happened. Anyways, we'll get to all that right after the break. Today's show is sponsored by Nasuni. There's a growing gap in AI right now between what's possible in theory and what successfully works at scale inside an enterprise. The difference comes down to unstructured file data. Many AI initiatives struggle because the file data they depend on is scattered, unstructured, and disconnected from where and how work actually happens. Nasuni changes that. It brings your unstructured file data into a single, secure foundation so AI, both generative and agentic, can access it with the context, governance, and performance it needs in production. Bring AI to where your unstructured data lives. See what it takes to activate your data for AI and request a demo at nasuni.com/AI. Today's show is sponsored by ShareGate. You're out of time. Copilot needs to be deployed ASAP, but your tenant really isn't ready for it. Years of data, permissions, and users lurk in its shadows, ready to be exposed by AI. ShareGate Protect sees it all, so you can find the exposure risks, fix them fast, and deploy AI with confidence. Microsoft 365 governance, they've got this. Learn more at sharegate.com/protect. And we're back, America's favorite monthly AI news show. Brandon Whichard, great to see you, man. How you been?
I've been fantastic as always, Brian. How are you?
I'm good. We got a lot to talk about, although I don't know if we have as much to talk about as April. April was a blockbuster month. May feels like people maybe started thinking about summer vacation a little bit. Where do you want to start? Do you want to start with the Pope now weighing in on AI, or do you want to start with our favorite punching bag, which is like what happened at OpenAI and, the multitude of goods and bads that happened over there? Where would you like to start?
Well, first, I don't feel qualified to comment on His Holiness' writing, so I don't know. I'm going to stay out of that. I'm going to avoid that trap. Like I don't know how I would say that, but yeah, I'm going to stay away from that. But I think where we start is like, as always at the beginning, it's like, let's just say the summary up front. That way, if the people don't want to listen, they can go do something else.
No, you got to listen. You got to don't be discouraging them.
That's right. Well, I was going to say, I feel like this month is a carryover of a common quote, famous quote, where someone said, nobody knows anything, right? I think that's the thing. And I want to add to that is and I heard someone else say this, and I'm going to add to it a little bit. It's like, one, we should all remember the following things. Like, very smart people cannot see the future. Very successful people cannot see the future. And in the likelihood or the crossover of a very smart and successful person, because you don't always have to be both, one, they can also not see the future. And I think that is the message, I think, from this month. It's like everybody, is talking about it. And one day some famous executive or some genius person will say something. And I feel like the whole market and it's like, oh, they just said this. And it's like, none of these people really know what's going to happen. And I think that is highlighted this month specifically. If we think about Anthropic, remember, as we recall, they were the divergent or the rebels who left OpenAI because they were more concerned with safety. Of course, OpenAI started in part by Elon Musk and others, right? Anthropic, and of course, Elon Musk goes out, tries to build his own thing, fails at it, but has a data center. But Anthropic and they've come together, if you will, is where kind of Musk have come together and they've done a deal around just leasing the data centers for something like $1 billion plus a month, right?
Yeah.
And I think this is just a good example of we would have said these two groups of people pretty much don't like each other and they are in the opposite ends of thinking about AI. But here we are, they're basically doing business together. Everyone's happy. And it just shows me that being very, very rich and being very, very smart, none of them foresaw any of this. And so that's my main takeaway going into this month. It's nobody knows anything. So when someone comes and says something crazy, like the latest one was we're in the foothills of the singularity. Maybe that's possible. I'm not saying that is or is not possible, but I'm just saying that is just one smart person making a prediction, but that person also cannot see the future. So don't get too carried away about anything that anyone says, us included. So there you go, Brian.
There you go. Well, that is a hell of an opening statement. I'm not sure if everybody turned off the listening at that point, but
the 3 people left. We'll continue.
I feel like we are this month felt like it was I don't want to say it was a reckoning, but it felt like something in which a lot of realities sort of came back to the somewhat normal that we kind of understand, right? So we have, and I'll just point out a couple of things and we can kind of talk about them. So we have a couple of pending IPOs. So Anthropic, OpenAI, SpaceX, which is Elon Musk's sort of conglomerate of a lot of stuff, inclusive of XAI, are all pending IPOs. Cerebras, who is trying to break into the chip space, into the inference space, did actually go IPO. They raised $5.5 billion in an IPO. They were going to do it a year ago. They ended up doing it this year. Seemed to go relatively well. They did break kind of Bill Gurley rule number 1 of don't let the bankers price your thing because they'll leave a lot of money on the table. Sort of did that, but so that was sort of like, okay, there is a relatively successful IPO, at least for the first couple of weeks. It didn't crash and burn. So you've got that thing going on, but we're also starting to see the numbers come out around what these IPOs might look like. And lo and behold, a lot of the numbers seem like they are potentially overinflated. The sort of, pseudo numbers that we've been hearing about how much Anthropic's revenue is or OpenAI's revenue. We're starting to sort of see the way they account for certain things. So I think there's going to be a certain buzz/reckoning that's going to happen in the IPO space now that the light's being shined on them. And then on the flip side, on the enterprise side, everybody and their brother announced some sort of agentic framework. Whether it was AWS announced agent code or agent toolkit, Google I/O, and you covered this, you watched this, at least the keynote and some stuff, like everything was agents. Red Hat came out with something called Metal to Agents, was sort of their kind of complete way of doing enterprise, more, on-prem centric or hybrid centric way of doing it. Palo Alto acquired a company that does security for AI agents. So it feels like, we have some of the things that are like the folks that were, hyping up a lot of money, their reckoning is sort of coming, and the enterprise is kind of all coagulating around the same sort of thing that they always talk about, which is we'd like to do productivity, but it's also complicated. It also needs security. It also needs governance, yada, yada, yada.
Full stack. Yep.
Yeah. I guess it doesn't surprise me. I mean, we've known for a while that at some point there was going to be certain amounts of like reality coming back to what was going on. I want to let's start with this because I think the IPO stuff people can dig into. I don't really care about the IPOs that much because the reality of those IPOs is like once they become public, then they can run like public businesses, and then we can kind of evaluate them on a quarter by quarter basis. Like that'll just happen. The enterprise piece was interesting to me. There was 2 conversations on the Software Defined Talk Slack, which we always recommend folks go take a look at that. Lots of good conversations. But there was 2 very basic conversations. One was from a gentleman named Prash who basically said, hey, my organization is starting to use AI. We can't figure out how to get anybody to collaborate, which I'm like, okay, that is classic enterprise. And then a gentleman named Michael out of the Netherlands asked, hey, have you guys figured out what the use cases are for enterprise AI? And I feel like that is sort of the epitome of where the enterprise is right now, right? Whereas, we talk about all these crazy things on the consumer side or as an individual, but I feel like if we were truly talking about day one, inning one stuff, that's where the enterprise is right now. And we haven't figured out how to solve those most basic things, which is like you're telling your whole organization to start adopting AI, and there is no way today, no structured way, no best practice way, other than kind of the classic, like, well, build a portal, build a catalog, build a registry, for how to scale or share enterprise AI stuff. Are you surprised that we're still at this point, or does this feel like, okay, yep, this is the normal that enterprise always falls into?
I think that's probably more on the latter there. I think it's probably more the normal side of it. But I think the way I would look at it is like, well, where do we see demand? Like a couple things I think are good. It's like one, the fact that Anthropic is going out and kind of having to do these data center deals at like a high cost tells us that like they are seeing real usage, right? Mm-hmm. And I think most of that usage is today mostly around software development. So that is the place of like, I don't know if we want to call it enterprise, AI, or it certainly maybe hasn't gone beyond that, but clearly everybody in software development is using it. And I think that's what's driving most of Anthropic's usage. So if we were just to sit back and say like, well, how is the enterprise using it? Well, most of the people that are developing software work at large companies of some kind, right? Yep. And they are the ones that are consuming the tokens. So I think for sure that has happened. Now the question I think that comes down to, and we can go through some of the various companies that like made layoffs and things like that, right? It's sort of like, how do those productivity gains expand inside the enterprise is one, and then two, how does it actually show up on the balance sheet, right? What are you doing that's new and exciting? And I think, we've talked about this on the show, is like, I still think AI is the benefits mostly accrued to the individual. So this personal software developer can be much more productive, but as studies have shown, that doesn't necessarily mean that the software can be deployed faster. It's sort of like, I get my work done faster, but we still have the traditional bottlenecks. And I think the same thing in other parts of the organization. And I think, what some of it's being revealed, I think some of it's kind of interesting around, there was a piece, that I didn't really like from the Cloudflare CEO talking about like, why he justified, various layoffs. And one of the things he kind of like, I would say kind of like, I don't know, kind of put people down a little bit, was call everyone like measurers, right? Like there's this group of people that are just measuring, like kind of bureaucrats in your company. And I think another way to answer your question though is like, you still have to figure out, kind of your fundamental question is like, hey, if we're a large enterprise, we still have to figure out what is it we want to do? How do we collaborate towards that goal? And then how do we even know we're making progress? Like those fundamental things. And it's like, yeah, you can have all these AI tools, but like, it's still very complicated. You know what I'm saying? Like I can write a report much faster, but it doesn't mean that do you still want the report? Are you reading the report? Right. Do you want a dashboard? What are you doing with it? So all of those questions, I think, kind of, if you will, to your point, is like, that's maybe where AI is kind of stuck, is it's like, it's like I can make certain tasks faster, but I can't make your bureaucracy go away. Even if you get rid of people, you still have to answer these questions.
Right. Yeah. No, I do think, this is the funny thing about enterprise is it's not exactly the same from iteration to iteration, but it does rhyme. And you go back to whether it's DevOps or cloud native development or 12-factor or any of these sort of things, and you go, hey, well, there was some initial use cases. There were some people that spoke at conferences and they were successful, and then everybody goes like, okay, cool. Like, why haven't you done 100 deploys 10 deploys in a day, or why haven't you And it ultimately comes back to being like, well, at some point the people are involved. There are people involved, and I think I think what you've said is exactly right. I think there's a couple of big misunderstandings in the enterprise. I think number one is it's complicated to make the AI specific to your business, because you don't just get to use the default models. You've got to basically train the models with your data or tune the models with your data. You got to figure out harnesses. So that in and of itself is hard. Number two, you haven't, as we've seen with some of these layoffs and the messaging around them is all gobbledygook, but it's like, we want you all to use AI because we want you to be all more productive. But then when we do lay off people, we don't give you any reason for why that is. And also, there's no best practices for how to go about doing this stuff, because who knows what tool you're using. And, so that there's no leadership coming as to what they want done with it. They're just like, just do the thing. Of which, if you asked anybody, like, is that a way that you would lead for any other part of your business? Like they don't just go to sales and go, well, here's the number, go sell more of it. And they're like, well, we're not making the number. Well, just sell more of it. Right. But that's kind of what we're at with AI right now. And I think it's going to be interesting. I don't think, I think you're right. Right now, all the value accrues to the individuals. The individuals aren't incentivized to be like, hey, let me tell you how I'm getting way better. Because I could get lumped into the next 100 or 1,000 or 4,000 or 25,000 that get laid off. But we've seen that behavior before, where it's like, I'm not helping the team any more than I have to. I'll do my job and, be able to go home at 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock or something. So. Well, I think because, all these reductions and stuff, it just kind of comes back to like the more simple questions. Like you see people kind of claim these productivity gains, but it's like the fundamental question is like, okay, are you able to go attract more new prospects for your customers faster? Like, okay, can you do that faster? Can you do that better? How is that actually happening? And then the sales side too. It's like, are you able to do more sales? Can you close sales faster and things like that? And it's like these problems never go away. And I don't, and that's probably the stuff that like AI is the furthest from. It's like,
AI can maybe can help you do better marketing copy, but like, is that going to actually, generate more leads? Maybe not. Right. And I think that's where the real disconnect is. And it's like that hard problem of like sales and the marketing, and I don't even call it marketing, just awareness, getting awareness, finding customers. Like, I think AI doesn't really touch that. It can only touch deliverables within that. But again, like I said, my running joke for a long time was like, I bet, people always be like, we need a data sheet. We need a better data sheet. And you're like, I'm pretty sure this data sheet isn't going to do anything, but like, we'll keep rewriting it for you if that's what you wish.
Right. Yeah. I'm sort of surprised. And I think part of it's because people I don't think people really kind of know how to use the technology other than using it like as a chat bot. And the small percentage who've now figured out like how to build some agentic stuff or build skills or whatever. I keep coming back to this idea of like, at least with cloud, you could point to Netflix and everybody would be like, hey, let's be like Netflix. Yeah. Like there is no Netflix. There is no Netflix at the enterprise is now like, I went to a conference, I heard Adrian Cockcroft speak, and we are now going to be AI first. I am convinced that we are going to be AI first. And like the fact that we just don't have that drumbeat beating, I think points to this idea that it is highly fragmented. It's kind of coming from the bottom up. As soon as you sort of get your first bill, as we saw in, whether it was from Microsoft or from Uber or from different,
you got to turn this thing off.
Oh God, this thing is I got to turn the spigot off. Whereas with like, the first couple with public cloud, it was like, it really wasn't the enterprise that was adopting it. It was like, it was the companies that were going and trying to like pick off pieces of the enterprise, right? It was all these startups that AWS was sort of enabling. And we just kind of don't have that same dynamic right now, which is, it's interesting. It's interesting to watch.
Well, another thing, just to build on your point there, is, the couple of announcements very similar, both OpenAI and Anthropic have essentially, announced, call them some type of consulting type organizations. They have different names, but it looks like forward deployed engineer, or FDE, seems to be the term of art these days. And that's a really good example of like, well, they clearly are seeing the same kind of things. It's not like we can't just get people to sign up for ChatGPT or Claude and expect things to happen. We actually need to pay usually pretty expensive people to go out, go sit with the customer and do a couple things. I think one, help them figure out what they should be doing, to your original point. Like, what is it we can even do with this? And then part two is like, how do we do it? And I think, and that would be interesting. Maybe we'll have to find some Anthropic FDE to come on one of our shows and tell us like, okay, like how much time are you spending just talking about like what you could do? Like, let's just call it problem discovery versus actually sitting down and like building, a specific system. That would be interesting to know.
Yeah, these dynamics are interesting. So the point that you pointed out is both Anthropic and OpenAI have either created partnerships with the leading consulting companies. OpenAI spun off a separate company called the Development Company, aptly named, I guess, sort of. But yeah, they're basically going to a bunch of these big consulting companies, and the equivalent is them saying, well, we don't really know how to do this ourselves, right? Because again, they're sort of like, look, we're just data scientists. We build the technology, you type words in, you make prompts, whatever. I don't know how to make a bank more efficient, but you guys sort of know that, like that's sort of your business. And so this isn't unusual. I mean, if you go back to like the early, cloud native days when people were like, hey, you're going to build applications differently. Like go back and look, the first thing that Cloud Foundry did, or, what was it called? Pivotal did, was they were like, oh, we're spinning up a thing with Accenture. We just spun up a $30 million lab with, so this
and they call it field CTOs, I think was their term at the time, right? That was kind of like send out a bunch of people to do that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And the interesting part of it was like, okay, cool. They went out or you bought time within one of their innovation labs, or, companies would do that kind of stuff. Mm-hmm. And that sort of stuff's interesting. But what those things end up becoming is like you're going to then convince companies to be like, okay, you need to create a center of excellence. And that center of excellence is going to be like 10 people who are really committed to doing it, right? So they're your like super users. And then their job is to be like, okay, once you figured some stuff out, now internally go figure out how to spread the gospel, go out how to, and again, you're running into the same like, okay, well, now you have to understand the org chart, and now you have to understand how to tell them to do it the way that you want to do it, as opposed to, and I think what's the interesting dynamic with these is like, if you ask most people like, hey, what does a consultant do? You'd be like, well, a consultant creates these really long reports that has all sorts of data in it and all sorts of stuff. And you're like, cool. So when you type stuff into ChatGPT or Claude and you've got, a pretty good prompt, like what are you creating? And they'd be like, basically the equivalent of what consultants do. And
Yeah,
so it's
same
interesting
kind
to
of
me
reports.
that now Anthropic and OpenAI are like, oh, the way for us to enable these things for people is to get the consultants who are basically kind of being put out of business or being, cut off at the knees as the lead for what they're doing, right?
Yeah.
Again, it kind of points to the idea of like, well, those guys don't want to build a sales organization because they're like, look, I need to put all my money into GPUs, so I'll outsource it to people. But the people they pick to outsource it to are like how motivated are they to do this stuff? Because we already saw an article that said like Accenture. Was it Accenture? It was one of the big ones where like they no longer can do per hour pricing. They're having to do like per outcome pricing.
Their margins are under attack as well.
Yeah,
right?
they're under attack, and they're gonna get into the thing where it's gonna be like, cool, I'm gonna give you an outcome, and as a CFO or a CIO or somebody, you'd be like, okay, cool. They're gonna scout that outcome. The first thing I would do is be like, okay, let me go find the best AI guy I have in the company, and be like, see if you can make this. You can have as many tokens as you want. See if you can do this yourself.
I feel like, I'm reminded of that, like that anecdote, like the frog and the scorpion, like swimming across. And then at the end, it's like, you have to just be careful, like who you get in. And I don't know, maybe that's what the ultimate goal here is. But I will say this, like maybe another way to think of this is slightly more growth oriented would be, maybe we're just focusing in the wrong places. Like, all these large enterprises want to take advantage of it. But as we talk about it, it's like a value accrues to an individual, and the smaller the team, I think the more value. And I'll just throw one out. I don't think it's really an AI story, but I think it's an interesting story in the sense of Mercury. Mercury is a bank, or is actually, let me correct myself. Mercury is a very popular bank type startup, a neobank that many startups use. Like they have something like 300,000 small companies. Okay. And they just recently, so a neobank is said basically they're not a bank, they're just a front end to a bank, and behind the scenes is actually some bank that has the charter and all this other stuff. Mm-hmm. But where I'm going with this is like they just recently announced that they completed, if you will, getting preliminary approval to become a bank, to actually become the bank behind the scenes, right? Mm-hmm. And I use them for some personal or some business stuff, and I think it's a great system. So no advertisement here. I just like it. But my point is just simply, it's like, no, they don't have, like, you can contrast that with JP Morgan. You know what I mean? Just I'm just picking one arbitrary bank, right? But it could be any large bank, and it's like, no, Mercury doesn't have all of this. They don't have these tens of thousands of associates and locations all over the world, but they do seem to have a better platform for just businesses that want to do, and they're hyper focused. And then now, if AI is going to allow them to like get through the regulatory process faster, become an actual chartered bank, then they don't, you know what I mean? They no longer need the traditional banking infrastructure. They're going to start doing it themselves. And maybe that's the example of like, and I think, I've said this a couple of times, like, again, not picking on anyone specific, but I'm just going to say all the hyperscaler portals, all their UIs, consoles. It's like when you log into these things, it is not good. It is not easy to use, right? In fact, I kind of joke, the certifications aren't about like technical certifications. They're about like learning which buttons to click inside these consoles. It's so complicated. Yeah. And it's like, a new entrant coming up, just like they were once the new entrants coming up and being like, we don't need all of this stuff. In fact, I'm going to let you just talk to, because they've all announced like an MCP, right? Like, okay, you can talk to it, but it's not really there versus something that's kind of native. It's like, no, we don't have all these console screens. We just have a basic console, and you just talk to it via AI, and it just kind of figures this stuff out for you, right? Because that's kind of what coding has become. It's like, I don't need all this. I don't need to know all this stuff. It kind of figures out all the trivia for me. So I do think maybe that's where the value is. So it's the smaller companies, it's the disruptors. So all these CEOs who are announcing layoff, it's like, well, someone's probably coming for your company too. You know what I'm saying? Like this console that you created, it's probably not that great, and it probably could be disrupted, just like Mercury's going to disrupt some banks out there as well.
Well, that's an interesting kind of teeing me up for something sort of. There was one article that I saw this week, one announcement that happened. So a company called Long Lake, which is a private equity company, bought American Express Global Business Travel, which I was sort of like, I had no idea that, lots of large companies use American Express Global Business.
Absolutely.
I don't love the experience. It's one of those ones where it's like, the front end of it's kind of okay. It's like any other travel thing, but like anytime you want to change anything, you're like, oh man, my event ended early. I need to, you got to call a number, and then it's a cost to do that. And also, these guys basically, they somehow American Express decided to carve it off and sell it off, or they got a great offer. And these guys basically just said like, this is a big cash cow kind of business. Again, I don't know why American Express sold it off, but instead of doing the typical private equity thing, which is like, we're going to load it up with a whole bunch of debt and then we're going to carve off, we're going to take off a whole bunch of quote unquote fat and then we're trying to resell it. They're like, we are going to take this thing, which is already sort of a good functional business that throws off a bunch of cash, and we're just going to go inside of it and we're going to re-engineer every process with AI in the middle of it. So they're kind of doing the same thing where it's like, I suspect it will be, far, far lighter in terms of people, but it also sort of, says, hey, like this process of people being like, I need to travel isn't going to go away, but could you reimagine it within an existing brand? And to me, that's an interesting, from an AI perspective, like this will be an interesting thing to sort of watch of, are there people who can figure, can kind of refigure a set of business processes within a brand, or does PE do what PE always does and just sort of falls back to their old ways of like, just get rid of the fat, load it up with debt, take the cash flows, and then, try and hand it off to some other, kind of sucker in the market sort of thing. I mean, to me, it feels a little bit like the blueprint for, what some of these internal, enterprise businesses should be looking at themselves. And maybe, probably not directly related, but to a certain extent, like, if you are that CEO and you're like, hey, how do I go about doing this? And people aren't necessarily adopting the technology as fast as we'd like to, I get bonus points for laying people off because the market goes, oh, you got far less costs. But does that also become the entry point for then being like, and now I'm going to introduce this new process? And, we haven't seen that sort of 1-2 combination happen yet, but I do wonder if we start to see a few of these types of things happen where, organizations go like, we're going to take that chunk of the business. We're going to get rid of all the middle management because like we've said, like all they're doing is pushing paper and, giving you their opinion on stuff and, building their fiefdoms. But, will businesses sort of look at stuff they do and go, it's a pretty good business, but it could be infinitely better, and hoping that people will come to that conclusion like hasn't worked. Like we've tried that for a while. So I don't know. I don't know if it's a complete canary in the coal mine, but I thought it was an interesting example of what somebody's trying to do.
I really like it. I mean, I think it's like, we can just go back to that banking example. It's like, on one hand, you have Mercury kind of rebuilding the bank from the ground up, but it doesn't mean JP Morgan and Bank of America, they can go top down. They can say, listen, we need to look at what's Mercury doing. Yeah. How do they do order processing or ACH transactions? Like, how do we rewire our ACH transactions so it's even more efficient? And what advantages do we have? Because we have the customers, we have the leverage, and Mercury's got to go do a lot of customer acquisition. We've got all that. So can we do it? But again, like this is the challenge. It's like, well, can you get a group of tens of thousands of people working towards that? That's sort of the large bank, or is it better to be on the Mercury side where it's like, well, we have a small team, everyone's figuring that out, so we just got to build the brand. So it's like, I mean, that's maybe the battle or the thing that's going to happen for the next several years. Yeah, no, it's interesting. I mean, we've been sort of down on AI. This news of the month, I think, we could throw one more in. I think people maybe they started to learn, but it doesn't feel like they've learned that if you're giving a keynote speech for a graduation, probably should not speak about AI. Just keynote speaker after keynote speaker at college and high school graduations, just getting booed out of the room for talking about it and doing it in like the worst ways possible. Like Eric Schmidt, former CEO at Google, was like, you need to figure it out. You have no choice. There was some music executive who went to a music college and literally was like, you're going to make AI music. Otherwise I'm going to steal all your idea. I mean, just the most tone deaf stuff possible. And it was interesting that nobody who went after them changed that. So it did give a good feedback of kind of the market sentiment of people who, either aren't doing podcasts on AI or building AI. Like there's a lot of negative sentiment as some of this stuff, whether it's data centers in your backyard or people telling you, you must adopt AI is it's not highly beloved at this point in time, which is very interesting. Yeah, well, I think that if anything, I think a lot of it's a more communications issue. And I think we've proven over the last month that the leaders of AI are very poor communicators. Because, what would you expect? I think people sometimes attack the students or whatever. They think, oh, people don't get it. It's like, listen, if you're just bringing what looks to be like, one, if the message is like companies doing as well as it's ever done, and we're laying people off. Okay, well, that's sort of like, if you're a college graduate, that gives you some uncertainty too. It's like, it's hard. They're all probably out there looking for jobs. They're all probably being told that the quote unquote entry level positions are being eliminated. And they're not really, like, there isn't anyone giving them, you know, some kind of like hope or something they can do. And it's just like, well, of course, like what do you expect people to be? I mean, you expect, especially when you're an executive and if you happen to be extremely wealthy, it's like, well, that's great for you. I'm glad that, you know, you're not going to be using AI, or you're just, you know, a thought leader giving speeches and you're super rich and, you know, your life is kind of set, but I'm starting my career. So I just think it kind of comes back to like, you've got to give people like some level of hope, and kind of to what your original question was, like, how are they going to leverage AI? I mean, and forget about building companies, just to like build a life that's meaningful to them, doing whatever, right? And it's like, not everyone's trying to be a billionaire. It's just like, but if you kind of tell a whole, especially people graduating college where they've spent a lot of money, you know, and they've spent a lot of money and time, and it's like, well, you guys are all not needed anymore. It's like, well, of course people are going to be mad. So I do think people need to look at how that's communicated, step one. And maybe for a lot of these executives, like, I maybe pass on the graduation speech. You know, maybe you don't do it. Or if you do, like, just make it 15 minutes, tell a few jokes, and just move on. Like, don't make it so dire for everyone. But again, like, I don't know. Some of these people, I'm like, just maybe let the class president speak, and let's just give out diplomas and have fun. Yeah,
no, I think you're right. I'll throw out one more thing that we saw out there. We did see a thing that OpenAI, who, as we mentioned at the top of the show, is getting ready to try and do an IPO, or at least they've announced it. They can't find anybody to run communications for them. They apparently have been trying everybody in Silicon Valley. Apparently everybody is like,
everybody's interviewed,
and they're all like, yeah, I'm going to take a pass on that one, because they're basically like, the person I'd be, you know, quote unquote, writing scripts for or whatever, you know, just does whatever they want. And so it does sort of leave you with the, you know, whether you're communicating about AI as a politician or as, you know, a leader of a business or whatever it is, like, there's going to have to be some ways to figure this out, because, you know, we're in for, you know, a lot of it coming our way. And if people kind of can't figure out a way to convince people to be like, you know, here's where the value is, here's where the win-wins are. If everything is sort of pitched as a win-lose, you know, it's going to be a problematic space. And you're, you know, like you've mentioned, we're not seeing very many people be very good at it. They sort of just come back to being like, you know, just do it. Like, you don't have a choice, just do it. And
well, I think on the comms issue, I think for all the people giving speeches and writing op-eds and things like this, I'm going to give some very good consulting advice to all of them. What they should do when they finish, they should take their piece, they should paste it into their favorite AI, Claude or ChatGPT, and they should say, read this over and tell me, make some critical comments and explain to me some potential reactions of people hearing this.
Yeah.
Please be very, if you will, direct with your feedback. I think if any of them had done that, and any of the AI systems that are popular, I think they would have gotten a pretty good, because you could do, as a test for all the listeners, take your favorite thing that maybe didn't land with you the right way, put it in AI and ask it to critique it. I think they would all get some very good feedback. And again, as the ones promoting AI, it seems like that's something very easy that they could all do and probably get some very candid feedback about their statements. And they could probably use AI to help them, if you will, rework their core thoughts so that they're maybe better, if you will, accepted. So I think it's a very simple thing to do. So I challenge all the leaders out there, why not do that and do it on your own? Don't have someone else do it. You go into your Claude yourself and just have your own little personal conversation and see what it says. It may surprise you. It may shock you a little bit that even maybe Claude's got some critiques that you didn't see coming. So check that out.
It is interesting. Yeah. Most people, I think, don't ever ask for negative feedback because they don't like to hear it. And then, if you just leave the defaults on for your favorite chatbot, it's going to encourage you, right? So if you want some negative feedback, also tell it, hey, you know, but please be honest.
But even some of these, I even think some of the ones that you don't even think you have to prompt it with like, be real, like you don't even have to be argumentative. I think there's a couple op-eds. You just take them just as they are, just as generic as possible. Please review. And see what it says. I think they'll give you some candid feedback. So it'd be interesting. So, and if you're really bold and you work at one of those companies, send that feedback to the executive that gave the presentation. Be like, hey, just in case you didn't see it, here's what Claude said about your recent op-ed. I would love for someone to do that. That'd be fun too.
Yep. Well, I'm going to wrap it up there. I did forget there was one last thing that I guess we should mention just for the sake of history and us talking about it. NVIDIA did have an earnings call. They did have earnings results. They made a lot of money. Mm-hmm. The one most interesting part of it was apparently Jensen is now breaking out CPUs as sort of its own TAM, as a potential $200 billion TAM that he hasn't talked about before. So we are definitely, so their growth has slowed down somewhat. I think it's 20%. Although it'd be interesting to sort of look at where their growth on a per quarter basis looks like, because a lot of companies become sort of cyclical, right? Like people do all their buying in Q3 or Q4. So I don't put as much thing in there, but as we've mentioned before, everything about Jensen is deterministic on him making the stock stay high, because then that gives him control over the entire industry. Yeah, he just found a $200 billion TAM, or he just created a $200 billion TAM around CPUs, which is not crazy given the fact that AMD stock is way up, Intel stock is way up. I am obligated to say the stock is now up 400% since Pat Gelsinger left. I like to keep track of that on a monthly basis, but. Yeah, it was interesting to see that was one of the big takeaways from that was he's trying to create non-accelerated compute TAMs out of NVIDIA. So it'll be interesting. We know they're making GPUs. It'll just be our CPUs. It'll be interesting to see how big that market becomes and who starts kind of playing in that space, because we've now got ARM, we've got NVIDIA, we've got a lot of people.
I have to say, I feel like we got to end where we started then. This just goes back to what we said at the beginning. No one knows anything. Here we are, Jensen Huang, the person has told us nothing about how accelerated computing and GPUs are taking over the world and CPUs are dead for I don't know, at least a decade, maybe longer. I don't even know how long. Here he is, basically, not only is he back, he's building CPUs, selling them and breaking it out. And then, of course, what I like to call the Halo Effect Hall of Fame, that's going to be the new CEO of Intel. Through absolutely no efforts of his own or Intel's own, they have fallen ass backwards into being one of the hottest stocks in the market. Turns out, if you just wait long enough and CPUs become really big and successful, then you're going to do well. And I'm sure Pat Gelsinger sits at home and is like, if I had just held on for a few more years, months, he would have been a hero. And instead, he's just extremely rich, probably on a beach somewhere. So I'm sure he thinks about how sad he is every day.
Yep, and shame on us for not, being able to predict the future and buying Intel stock at $20 instead of
we were stupid.
Where it is now at 120. So none of us know anything. There we go. The Enterprise AI Show. None of us know anything. Tune in next week for more, guesses and predictions that we may or may not be right. All right, man. Well, thank you as always. Another good month. I'm going to give this month maybe like a B. I don't think it was an A+ month. Last month was sort of an A+ month. I don't know. Any thoughts from you? Different grading on that?
No, I think it's about right. I think we went in high hopes. I thought the trial would be more exciting. I thought there'd be more. There wasn't much fireworks, so it's like, I guess season 3. I guess we'll have to hope for a summer season of excitement. That's right. We never know. We never know what's going to happen. Maybe people will be fired, hired, acquired. All of that's coming. Stay tuned. We'll cover it all here.
That's right. All right, folks. With that, thank you for Brandon for jumping on as always, and thanks to y'all for listening and telling a friend about the show. So with that, we'll wrap it up. We will talk to you next week and next month for this show again.
Thanks for listening. Check us out at theenterpriseaishow.com for past shows, newsletters, and all things Enterprise AI.